Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to learn with you today. So let me begin with this. Um, I said, "Good evening, Doc." He looked shocked that I have a big voice. "What are you?" He keeps asking me. "Why are you like that?" In the first place, we went there for my mom. He was not supposed to criticize or interrogate me for what I am. Why are you like that? Do your mom and dad allow you to be like that? This quote is from Chanel, one of the transgender women respondents of a 2014 study entitled Kwentong Bebot, the lived experiences of lesbians, bisexual, and transgender women in the Philippines by the Rainbow Rights Philippines, which is a legal think tank uh, that also advocates for the rights of LGBTIQ people here in our country. So this quote demonstrates that discrimination also happens within healthcare settings, and this needs to be addressed if we are to affirm that the right to the highest attainable standard of health is a human right for all. So today, we are going to have a SOGIESC or SOGIESC 101, which is an introduction to SOGIESC or SOGIESC, which stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics. So again, I'm Naomi Fontanos, and you can find me on Twitter. Our objectives for this at the end of the session, you should be able to differentiate among sexual orientation, gender identity and gender expression, and sex characteristics or SOGIESC or SOGIESC. You should also be able to recognize that lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex, queer, and asexual plus or LGBTIQA plus people face specific health disparities or inequities. And at the end of the session, you should be able to uphold compassionate, quality, and respectful medical care as a human right for all. So, SOGIESC or SOGIESC, what does it stand for? It stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics. Sex characteristics answer the questions: what are your chromosomes, genitals, hormones, and reproductive organs? Gender identity answers the questions: who are you, what is your gender, or what gender do you identify yourself as? Gender expression answers the questions: what do you wear, how do you act or speak? And sexual orientation answers the questions: who do you like, who are you attracted to, or who do you love? So let's break down those concepts one after the other. Sexual orientation is SO in SOGIESC, and it refers to a person's physical, romantic, and or emotional attraction towards other people. This definition is provided by the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. So when we talk about sexual orientation, that includes those who identify as heterosexual or people who are attracted to people of the opposite sex. So if you're male, you're attracted to someone who's female, heterosexual. If you're female, you're attracted to someone who's male. That makes you heterosexual. Sometimes we call this heteronormative because it seems as if being heterosexual is considered as the normal sexual orientation or the normative sexual orientation. But of course, we know that there are other sexual orientations. So, gay people or a gay person is someone who is attracted to people of the same sex. So, the word gay can be used to describe someone who's male or female. But more specifically, if a male is attracted to another male, that is a gay person. And if a female is attracted to another female, that is a lesbian person. So we know a similar term that describes these people. The old term is homosexual, but currently, this is already considered offensive and derogatory. So we prefer to call a gay person someone who's lesbian. Then, of course, there are other sexual orientations, as we said. There are bisexual, pansexual, and asexual people. So bisexual people are those who are attracted to people of both sexes. So you can be male, but attracted to both male and females. In the same way that you can be female, but you're attracted to both males and females. Pansexual is a sexual or romantic attraction that's not limited to any particular sex or gender identity. Um, the prefix here is pan and it means all. So someone who's pansexual is attracted to all people, or it can be possibly attracted to all people. Someone who's asexual, on the other hand, has little or no sexual attraction to anyone, or sometimes they have little or no sexual contact at all. So this is not the same as celibacy or abstinence, because celibacy and abstinence are things that you choose. Now let's go to GI in SOGIESC, which stands for gender identity. So when we talk about gender identity, this pertains to who or what you are, what you think about yourself, what gender you see yourself as. So that is your gender identity. And we describe gender identity as something that reflects a deeply felt and experienced sense of your own gender. And this is independent from your sex assignment at birth. This is not determined by your assigned sex at birth. And when we talk about various gender identities, there are people who we describe as cisgender. The term cisgender describes people whose gender identity matches their sex assignment at birth. So if you were assigned male and you identify as a male or a man, you are a cisgender man. Or if you were born uh, a baby and you were assigned female at birth and identify as female or a woman, then you are a cisgender woman. There are other gender identities, and these include being transgender. So, transgender is a term for people whose gender identity does not match their sex assignment at birth. So, transgender is different from cisgender. The trans in transgender means there is a movement, okay? Whereas the cis in cisgender means there is no movement away from the sex assignment at birth. So, the term transgender or trans may describe people who identify as a trans man, a trans woman, a transsexual person, a cross-dressing person, and genderqueer person. So let's describe these other people under the transgender umbrella. So transsexual is a person who has undergone hormone replacement therapy or gender affirming surgeries in a process that we usually describe as a gender transition. As cross-dressing person or a cross-dresser does not modify his or her body but adopt the clothes of another gender, either temporarily or permanently. So the last population under the transgender umbrella are those we describe as genderqueer, or people who identify as neither a man or a woman, or they identify both as a man and a woman, or they don't identify as either man or woman. So in a sense, they are sort of interrogating the gender binary. Okay? Now let's go to gender expression, or the E in SOGIESC or SOGIESC. Gender expression is through their physical appearance, and this can include their manner of dressing, their hairstyle, accessories, cosmetics, and their mannerisms, their speech, behavioral patterns, their names, and their personal references. So gender expression, like gender identity, may not conform to the person's sex assignment at birth. Gender expression may also not conform to the person's gender identity. So you may identify as male, but you can wear something that's female, and vice versa. So there are different terms to describe gender expression. So one of them is gender nonconforming. So gender nonconforming is a very broad term that refers to people who do not behave in a way that conforms to the traditional expectations of their gender, or their gender expression does not fit neatly into a category. This is not the same as androgynous, because androgynous is presenting us neither distinguishably masculine nor feminine. Okay, so those are words that describe gender expression. Now let's go to the last part in SOGSC, sex characteristics. This can include their genitalia or other sexual and reproductive anatomy, their chromosomes, hormones, and secondary physical features emerging from puberty, or what you call their secondary sex characteristics. So, um, our sex characteristics may be typical for male or female, but sometimes they are not. And when that happens, we call this being intersex. So, intersex is a word that describes individuals with any of several variations in sex characteristics, including their chromosomes, their gonads, sex hormones, or genitals that do not fit the typical definitions for male or female. So, the old term for intersex is hermaphrodite, but we don't use that anymore because it's considered derogatory. Equally derogatory is the medicalized term for intersex, which is disorder of sex development, or DSD. You may know different variations of intersex in terms of chromosomes. So many of you know as medical practitioners that chromosomes are not only XX or XY, there can be several variations like XXY, etc. Or you may know intersex variations based on hormones. There is an intersex variation, for example, called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, where the body of a female produces an inordinate amount of testosterone, which masculinizes that body. And sometimes those with CAH identify themselves as male, even if they were assigned female at birth. So we have no time to discuss this, but you can research this on your own. Now, just to go back. SOGIESC is our overarching concept for today. So again, it stands for sexual orientation, gender identity and gender expression, and sex characteristics. So based on our discussion, when we say sex characteristics, they describe sex characteristics that are typically female, typically male, and then there are sex characteristics that are described as intersex. When we describe our gender identity, we use the words woman, man to describe ourselves, but there are also people who identify as queer, who are neither man nor woman. And then in terms of gender expression, you may have a gender expression that is typically feminine, that typically masculine, but you can also have a gender expression that is androgynous or gender nonconforming. And then in terms of sexual orientation, you have sexual orientations of being heterosexual, gay, lesbian, bisexual, asexual. So putting all of these together, let's map them again. So in terms of sex characteristics, you have female, male. In terms of gender identity, you can identify as a cisgender woman or cisgender man. And then in terms of gender expression, you may have feminine or masculine gender expressions. And then in terms of sexual orientation, you may identify as someone who's heterosexual, but that's not the end of the story, as you know, because in terms of sex characteristics, there are people who are intersex. In terms of gender identity, there are people who identify as trans woman or trans man or queer. And then in terms of gender expression, there are people who identify as androgynous or gender nonconforming, meaning they present as androgynous or gender nonconforming. And in terms of sexual orientation, you have people who call themselves gay, lesbian, bisexual, asexual, and pansexual. Okay, so when we talk about the lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, and asexual plus, or the LGBTIQA community, we are talking about them in terms of sex characteristics. This covers intersex people. In terms of gender identity, we are describing transgender women and transgender men, as well as queer people. For gender expression, we may be referring to androgynous or gender nonconforming forms of gender expression. And then in terms of sexual orientation, you have being LGBT, LGBAP, right? So in the initialism LGBTIQA plus, being a lesbian is a sexual orientation. Gay is a sexual orientation. Bisexual is a sexual orientation. But transgender describes a gender identity. Queer can describe both sexual orientation and gender identity and gender expression. Intersex is a term that will describe sex characteristics. And asexual describes a sexual orientation. The plus sign just means that this is an inclusive initialism and may include those who want to add themselves to this alphabet soup, if you may, in the future, who are not yet named in this initialism. Okay, so just to wrap up our discussion for this afternoon, remember that all of us, not only LGBTIQA people, have our sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression and sex characteristics. But note that LGBTIQA plus people experience violence, discrimination, and harm based on their SOGIESC throughout their life course. So they may experience violence, discrimination, and harm from childhood to adulthood, which results in minority stress, which is a chronic stress from stigmatization. And this also results in trauma. Okay. And it's also important to note that the violence, discrimination, and harm that LGBTIQ people experience may intersect with discrimination that they also experience based on their race, their ethnicity, their indigeneity, their sex, gender, language, religion, belief, political or other opinion, nationality, national or social origin, economic and social situation, birth, age, disability, health, including HIV status, migration, marital or family status, or being a human rights offender or other status. And this comes from the Yogyakarta Principles plus 10. So, as medical practitioners and service providers who will also deal with members of the LGBTIQA plus community, please remember that the attainment of the right to the highest attainable standard of health, particularly for key affected populations, requires not only health sector interventions that may include HIV prevention, testing, counseling, treatment, and care, etc., but as well as an enabling environment. And that pertains to, for example, anti discrimination and protective laws. This comes from the World Health Organization consolidated guidelines on prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and care for key affected populations, which came out in 2014. So, just once again, to bring us all to the same page, I would like to share with you something that's viral because I know that many of you are familiar with viral load, but this was a viral tweet. So the tweet goes, today in one of our med classes, we talked about LGBT patients and the professor isn't taking anyone's shit. Student, what if we don't feel comfortable treating someone following that lifestyle? Professor, find a different career. So on that note, I end today's session on SOGIESC. I hope that you learned many things today. And I would also like to thank Professor James Doble, who is the SOGIESC consultant of the UP Center for Women's and Gender Studies, as well as the UP Center for Women's and Gender Studies for these slides. There are references at the end of the presentation that you may yourself look up for more clarification. Thank you very much, and it was my pleasure to share this session with all of you.